Hi folks, welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're talking about mentoring in coaching and coach education. So this topic is of particular interest to me because it is my research topic for my PhD. So I researched the effect that mentors and people within a sporting culture affected coaches going through a coach education cycle. So first let's look at what is a mentor. So it's often described as an experienced or trusted advisor. It's also described as a person who trains or counsels someone in their development. And most importantly for us, why does it apply to coaching, or how does it apply to coaching? Obviously it's important first and foremost in the coach-athlete relationship, and that's where most of your coaching philosophies might have described an element of mentoring within that relationship, and that's particularly important. Coaches can have informal mentors, and those are people that a coach might look up to, and you've already described in some of your posts online how coaches in professional sport might have influenced your thoughts, and they certainly influenced your thoughts in terms of your responses on Milo. So they might be termed informal mentors. It also applies in coach education because in many instances to progress through coach education you need to have a formal mentor, or you need to be in a formal mentoring relationship in order to gain accreditation hours, etc. Okay, so importantly, research suggests that coaches value this knowledge of their formal and informal mentors, and they value it even more than what they get from coach education courses. The important thing to remember though is it's really difficult for those coaches in the early stages of their learning, so the neophyte or beginning coaches, to consider and reflect on coaching processes. And so in this way, some of those coaching processes can become taken for granted. Okay, so as a new coach, working with an older coach, it's sometimes really difficult to look critically at what they're doing, why they're doing it, and in this way reflect. So it's been discussed by scholars, the effect that taking for granted such coaching practices can have both positive and negative effects. It can recycle these practices and make them ongoing without critical thought. So let's think about some of those taken for granted assumptions. So obviously you guys can remember the term embodiment. You're working through your responses to assessment task 1 at the moment, I'd say. So what might you think are some of the implications of mentoring in coaches, or the taken for granted assumptions? So some of the positives might be those coaching practices that are appropriate and well developed and perhaps critically thought out. But some of the less positive aspects, or less that are taken for granted and recycled, can be things like the approaches. Sometimes they're characterised as old school training, where particularly in my sport, swimming, swimmers are exposed to very high volumes of training with little focus on technique. So this is a very traditional approach to swimming training, and I think it's sometimes been characterised in discussion board responses about AFL training or footy training. People have described it as hard style coaching, where the coach might be very hard-nosed and very forthright in their views and not very flexible, and perhaps not very critical. And if that coach was to be a mentor, perhaps the potential negative is that the mentee coach, the new coach, the neophyte coach coming through might take for granted that this is an appropriate way to coach and continue along this path without really critically reflecting on the coaching process. So obviously mentors seek to empower, and that's the ideal that is utilised by coaching sporting bodies in their development of coaching materials. So they want to empower coaches to become better at what they do. But I think we need to problematise or consider empowerment as an impossible fiction. So something that's a little bit, or possibly not as easily achieved as one might think. So power can be used in a number of ways, and it can be used to bring about a certain kind of individual with certain kind of characteristics. Now, some of you might think that's appropriate. We want a strong-willed and hard-nosed athlete who takes orders very well. Now, this also translates to the mentor-mentee-coach relationship, where the road to salvation is dependent upon the knowledge of one's own inadequacy. So as the mentee coach, the new coach, you have to submit to the more senior coach. You have to acknowledge your inadequacies, and you have to take on their knowledge. So their assessment of you is that you need to be more compliant and surrender to them. And this is really a form of disempowerment, and it's something that's really embedded within coach education programs, and it's something that we need to consider as we all go through this coach education process. It's important to consider the relationships of power that you might be immersed in, potentially as in a mentor-mentee relationship within a coach education pathway, but also in such informal but formative roles of a junior coach or within a coaching hierarchy. So my research centred on an investigation into disciplinary actions of mentor coaches and how it can stifle creativity. So what I was concerned with was how it might limit your imagination. It might produce a subjected, practiced and docile body, and what that means is a person who acts without thinking. Okay, so that recycles practice rather than reflects on theirs and others' practice. So in order to do this, I dissected, or I looked at stories of experience from coaches. And I did that through a Foucauldian lens. Now, and some of this stuff is quite heavy, but it's important that you have a little bit of a read through this next passage, because it describes and really unlocks how power can be have such a massive effect on coaches. So the sports governing body is a collection of practitioners subscribe to a set of attitudes and behaviours that are key indicators of coaching ability. So the formal teaching of some of these happens in coach education, but the most effective way that this happens is in the normalisation of your actions. Now this is brought about by perpetual penalty. So in order to normalise the actions of people beneath them, institutions, they differentiate individuals, they hierarchise, so they provide levels for them to sit within, they homogenise, so they make them all the same, and they also can practice ways of excluding. So some of these systems of penalty are enacted by using disciplinary punishments to discourage behaviours that are not appropriate. So if we've got this hard-nosed coach developing a more junior coach, they might not take a shine to a more thoughtful approach with their athletes. The senior coach might find a way of disciplining or embarrassing that junior coach in order to bring him into line. So this is the sort of perpetual penalty that some coaches use to enact power within the coaching process. So some of these behaviours, they can be as simple as your coaching choices, and I've got them made by Aaron. I think that's a typo. And so if they're divergent from the head coach, they can incur deprivations, humiliations that penalise that learning coach. So this is the way that discipline refers to the penalty of the socially constructed norm. Okay, and in this way, this sameness or this consistent approach by the sports governing body and by the coach who develops the mentee coach is enacted. So what does it mean for you? I know that's all very heavy. So in order to reflect on your practice, I think it's important to think about or consider this following question. Whose knowledge and whose point of view is represented in the knowledge being reproduced in the training session? So where did this information come from? Who developed this information? By asking ourselves that question, we're looking at if we have considered where the information came from, who developed the information, why it was developed, and what's the reasoning behind it. So this is the critical reflection on practice that just doesn't seem to get done by beginning coaches. So whose knowledge, whose point of view is represented in the knowledge reproduced in the training session? That's really important. Colley, another prominent author, also asks us to remember that power can empower, but it can also be repressive, so that planned efforts to create empowerment are not always guaranteed or do they have consistent outcomes. So caring for another person, caring for an athlete, caring for a more junior coach can often and easily slip into controlling that junior athlete, controlling that junior coach. So you control their thinking. So it's important to consider the productive and repressive elements of power. Okay, and this is the challenging part where what do we do? So we need to challenge the dominant paradigm, both as the mentor and as the mentee. So Colley encourages mentors to minimise the authority vested in them by institutions. So consider a peer-based collective. Okay, so thinking of in group terms and how they can reduce their power over people that they have the opportunity to shape. So it's important to empower athletes/junior coaches by having this agenda of support and self-determination. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase used in coaching terms before, self-determination. Okay, also as a mentee, it's incumbent on you to critically reflect on your practice. And you reflect by analysing, reconsidering and questioning your experiences, the practices that you utilise and that you're exposed to. So critical reflection involves sort of an awareness of and a commitment to anti-oppressive practice. Okay, and this anti-oppressive practice considers practices which serve to control and develop docile, unthinking both athletes and coaches. Okay, so that's the anti-oppressive practice that Colley is talking about there. Okay, I think that brings us to the end, and it does. So very important to consider how you as a coach transfer power to your athletes, how you control or empower them, and also how you experience power as a coach in your learning journey. Okay, and how you reflect on what you've learned and what you're recycling as a coach.